I'm just really pleased that we have the chance to chat for a little bit. I remember early in my career your arrival at the San Francisco Foundation and how it was both symbolic of new frontiers for women of color getting into philanthropy leadership roles, but also just the fresh thinking you brought to the foundation it was just so revitalizing. So I loved it catching up, coming full circle as I've come back on board with NCG. I should admit, we're collecting secret hobbies from our speakers. So I'm wondering
Uh,
if you can share something you absolutely love doing outside of work that your colleagues would never expect.
I'm pretty predictable, Dwayne. I'll be honest with you. But I will tell you a funny story. So, in my early life, I'd get an orchid and it would die, and I'd get an orchid and it would die. And when I became director of health, they sent me this massive orchid. And I decided I just could not let that orchid die. And so I started studying, like, really, how do you water them? What light do they need? Blah, blah, blah. So even though it's sort of my daughter would say, a bougie flower, um, I like orchids now, and I have them all over the house, and we have them all over the foundation. And yeah,
And
you
they'll
got to
survive.
say they survived. Even the big one that I got many, many, many moons ago still flowers on occasion for me.
Wow, that's
I
awesome.
know, I know.
There's something symbolic of that. I'm sure we'll get to it.
We'll get
Uh,
to that, right?
well, just appreciate the time today and wondering if you might start by sharing a bit how your organization has been confronting the need to take on some of the stark racial inequities we're seeing revealed for some.
California Healthcare Foundation has a very interesting niche, right? Because it has, since its inception, really focused on the delivery system itself. And in that regard, you know, I worked in it, I trained in it. I understand all of the processes that happen inside hospitals and healthcare centers. And I've always been aware of uh, the many challenges within the delivery system that don't work for people who are low income or don't speak English or Black or, fill in the blank, many, many reasons why it doesn't always work well. And so um, it is not at all surprising that here we are in another moment historically in the country of racial reckoning. We're in this pandemic moment where all eyes now are on these delivery systems, these hospitals, and these clinics. And, you know, in somebody who I would say is relatively speaking late career, it is to me urgent, like absolutely urgent, that we not let this pandemic, the crisis it's created, the racial reckoning and conversation that we're having in the country, to address things that have been that way since I was a medical student, right? I mean, birth equity. Black women die giving birth 3 times, 4 times, depending on where you're looking. And those kinds of statistics have been with us forever. I mean, healthy, US healthy 2020 or 2000, we have all these metrics, and we don't really move the dime on most of those metrics at all. So, being in the space is, one where I'm not learning philanthropy, right? I'm glad I'm doing healthcare philanthropy when I've done philanthropy a bit, because you kind of know what the tools are, right? And so I think California Healthcare Foundation, it's an interesting organization. It's had 2 leaders in its 25 odd year history, both of us people of color, both of us very different leadership styles, but both of us people of color. And yet the organization doesn't remotely look like the state of California. It's based in downtown Oakland. And so you got to ask yourself, well, how does that come about, and why is that, right? So you got to do self-reflection. You got to be very vigorous about running through policy windows and system change windows that have opened in this moment of time. You have to take lessons that you've learned from the past, and there are plenty. I hope we get to talk about some of them and see really how can you apply them with urgency, and really just persistence, because none of these systems give in to change readily.
I appreciate that. And on that thought, this moment is a lot about Black and Indigenous leadership stepping forward, being at the forefront of the movement. How do you navigate that from a delivery system perspective? What would that mean if we could actually achieve that?
Well, so, there are people of color who went into healthcare to change the system and to make it responsive, because it was a calling and because they saw inequities in their life experiences and their family experiences. I mean, for me, I spent most of my very early years with my paternal grandmother in a very small railroad town in southern New Mexico on the New Mexico border. There was no physician there. Um, and you could see that people who needed care, you had to get in a car if you had a car, and go to Tucson or go to El Paso, go to one of the major urban areas for care. And so I think in the delivery system are all kinds of leaders. They're just being asked to do 15 different things, right? They're asked to do research, they're asked to do teaching, they're asked to do quality assurance, they're asked to do diversity training, they're asked to lead committees. And that workforce has been stagnant in terms of its diversity for 35, 40 years, if not longer. And so really understanding that pipeline, how do people get in the pipeline, who builds that pipeline, how do we reach into communities to have them see the opportunity to become a nurse or to become a respiratory therapist or to become a physician? Because none of these systems change solely outside in. As my older brother used to say, you have to get inside and unlock all the windows and let people in. It's a very good metaphor that I've held in my career. He was an activist, big time Chicano activist, did a lot of work in economic development, and he was an organizer fundamentally. He's a brother. My oldest brother was like 25 years older than me, and so really a mentor for me. And that's what he used to say. You got to get in on the inside and open up the windows and doors. And it needs pressure from the outside, as you know.
Well, I'm going to hold that metaphor for a moment. Peering ahead 5, 8 years, what would wild success look like for you?
Wow. Well, um, you know, start with the delivery system would look like the people it serves. Because until that happens, it won't. It just won't. I mean, if people talk about lived experience. When I first got out of medical school, it was the middle of the AIDS epidemic, and I lost a brother to AIDS in the early years of the HIV epidemic. It makes you have a sense of urgency when it is in your community and it's in your family, in a way that is very hard to be taught. And I worked alongside, many, many, many dedicated, talented professionals. Some of whom, by the way, are pinch hitting now in the pandemic response. And so for me, California is the most diverse state in the country. Our workforce does not remotely look like the people of California. We helped fund a plan to get us to 2030, 10 years, not 8, but 10 years, where the workforce in healthcare and in public health would look like the state of California.
Okay.
And I think if we got there, the delivery system would be much more responsive to the needs of families and communities throughout the state and really throughout the country. And I think it's possible.
I want to take us from the system level down to your more immediate sphere of influence, the organization level. And I know personally people you have mentored and whose lives you've changed professionally through working with you. What have you learned about yourself and your work at this point in your career? What drives you to do the things you do?
Well, look, again, late-ish career, I think one of the things that I really enjoy about what I'm doing now is seeing the next generation of leaders taking their mantle. And that's happening in so many places. And I, occasionally consult with them. I'll occasionally nudge them. They might call me for advice. I might make a suggestion to them. But, when you've been at it as long as I have, Dwayne, and you look around, there are folks that we've worked with that are now running major public agencies. There are people out that are serving in state government. There are people out working in the federal government. There are people running philanthropic organizations. I mean, the generational shift. I mean, when I, when I came to San Francisco Foundation, it had been around 50 years and it had 3 leaders, all white men. And that's sort of been the history of my career. I mean, when I became director of health, I was the first woman. I was the first Latina. I was the first openly gay person. I mean, it was, and what I see now is all of the next generation of leaders who aren't the first, and they have their own leadership style, and they've learned different things, and they've had different roles. And I look around and sort of say, my job now is to be wind at their back. And so as opposed to, cutting through and being kind of cutting edge, now I feel like I can, say, hey, it's your turn for you to take that role.
Well,
and I feel really good about that.
Well, and also you're making it so that some of those leaders aren't the first two or the first person, the first this or that to do those roles. You've actually opened some of those doors.
Yeah,
it's kind of ironic.
When I took those jobs, that wasn't how I was thinking about it, Dwayne, right?
No, not at all.
But, I prioritize, there's a group of, clinical fellows at UCLA, and they're all people of color. And, they've got this fellows group, and, will you come online and talk to them? I'm like, of course I will. Like that might be the biggest point of influence I have beyond my president's fund and a grant making portfolio. Because, it's a much more diverse group than I experienced when I was in a similar situation. And in part, I want them to understand all the places of influence that they can take their passion and their vision. And so for me, that's like the most joyous part of my job in many, many ways.
I shouldn't admit this on camera. The hardest calls to turn down are ones asking for a little bit of your time for your insight, right? I experienced that myself, even in a new job where I'm trying to make all the time to learn the ropes. When somebody needs mentorship that is part of that next generation, it's hard to not take that call. Just one or two other questions. What are you finding as putting your team at its own growth edges at the Healthcare Foundation? What's the biggest challenge culturally, in terms of changing systems?
You can't ask a big delivery system to change its culture and not be willing to change your own. And, I think for CHCF, very different style leader than Mark Smith. I always start with what's our board? How does it reflect our values as an organization, where we're going? Many organizations don't have that advantage. The organization's trying to push the board. I learned very early on, I learned this at San Francisco Foundation in large part because I worked with amazing board chairs. Really, I mean, that was for me a real leadership journey. All the different board chairs that I worked with, their styles, their walks of life, their points of influence. And I learned very early on, you need to create a board that is wind at the back of the organization. And so I did that first, and then said, okay, now how do we look at diversity and inclusiveness within our own shop? Had to get the right person in HR. Now have an African-American man running talent management for the organization. And so we started this work internally around inclusiveness, around accessibility, and that work preceded George Floyd, the current racial reckoning acuteness that we're in. There's always, it's always been there, but it has become so acute with social media and the like. And before the pandemic, and we spent a lot of time trying to find the right fit of an organization to help us through that. And people talk a lot about transparency. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot. But what I said was, we're going to do an assessment. It'll be anonymous, and we're just going to put it on a slide, and we're all going to look at it. And that's always hard to do. And we did it. And it's an organization that leaned into it. There was a ton of work to do on that space, and part of it is doing that. All of us hold memories of injury quite intensely. It's not like recurring injury wanes with time. Mm-hmm. And so you can do a lot of work on training and tools and nomenclature and skill building. Healing and trust building are really two things that, for me, at the end of the day, it all boils down to a certain extent of how much healing, and how does the healing make us do better at what we are really blessed to do. I mean, come on, those of us who are in philanthropy, we can work from home. We have great privilege. We have great access. And so the, again, sense of urgency for addressing the things that are painful within an organization, I think as a leader, you have to really own. It doesn't matter whether it happened on your watch or it happened on somebody else's watch. You have to own it as yours, and you have to help people in the organization to be able to give voice to it. And it's not just because, oh, I said this, oh, that made you feel this way, oh, I'm sorry. That alone doesn't create the kind of cohesiveness we need.
I know I'm getting to know better, I should say, the unique experience of being the CEO. You've been doing it for a long time in a lot of places. How do you find joy? What's your self-care practice that keeps you fully on when you're on?
Well, I'd say a couple things. One is you got to find a place to stay humble, right? And my wife does that for me. My daughter does that for me. My family does that for me. And so, I learned quite a long time ago that I'm really not building a resume. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is trying to build lasting organizations that will have people in them that will continue the fight that I probably won't be able to finish, because it's going to be a long journey. As they say, it's a marathon, all those, metaphors. But I love what I do. I have not ever one day been bored in my job, any job. Not in residency, not in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, not when I became director of health. I mean, when I went to San Francisco Foundation, I knew nothing about philanthropy. I knew nothing about how to run an endowment. And so for me, I have a love of learning. And so, the question is, what are you exposing yourself to, and how are you continuing to learn and grow? And, my pots have gotten bigger and slower over time, but I've been willing to jump into pots that I just didn't know a whole lot about. And most of the time, I've just found interesting people, relevant work, lots to learn. And so that's just part of being a doc, is sort of how I view it. You just have this kind of incessant curiosity in some ways. So for me, I love what I do. I don't make any choices that compromise time with family and being able to be present in family. And part of learning is working with people who don't think like you. I mean, I built a management team at the California Healthcare Foundation. I've got somebody in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s, and in their 60s. It's the most age-diverse management team I've ever had. Think very differently, willing to respectfully disagree with each other. And I find we all make better decisions that way. And so for me, I stopped building a resume a long time ago. It's very freeing. It allows you to sort of say, what do I love doing? Am I doing meaningful work? And can you sleep well at night that you're making a difference? And I've been super lucky that way.
Well, not many people can say they've enjoyed every day of their professional careers. I know we've all benefited from that. I was trying to think about how long I've admired your work, and your daughter walking on screen drove that home because I remember the arrival. And
That's
so,
right.
so thank you for your long service in this and other fields. So glad to have you helping us lead the charge in the health delivery systems arena. And I'm looking forward to what the next years bring.
Likewise. Thanks for spending some time with me, Dwayne. Really good to see you. I'm so glad you're in the role. And like I said, wind at your back. Totally wind at your back. Be well. Be safe.
Thank